Jazz emerged in New Orleans around the turn of the century, and it is now heard all over the world. It developed from the music of the Southern Negroes and became one of America's major cultural achievements in the 20th century. Today we will hear George Lewis's Ragtime Jazz Band, the only remaining group playing in the classic tradition of New Orleans jazz. In the George Lewis Band, we have a link with the past. Discovery! Presented by the San Francisco Museum of Art and station KPIX. And now your host for today, Dr. Lloyd Luckmann.
Phillip Elwood, you're a jazz historian. And all I really know is that jazz is everywhere. And I know this from the fact that the young people are always listening to records, and I hear terms about swing and bop and progressive in connection with jazz. But that's about the extent of my knowledge. And give me a definition of jazz, will you?
Oh, no, Lloyd. We're not going to start with a definition of jazz at
No?
all. You've got to ask that question. Many people say you're never going to find out.
Oh.
It's just one of those things. Being an art form, it's hard to explain. I think maybe look at this map and see if maybe we can't get it from here. Now, New Orleans was the center of the culture of the South. It was here that the Negro musicians came after the Civil War. It was from this source that they started spreading their music around the country. For instance, up in St. Louis, 40 years ago, ragtime was the big rage, and it was from there that it spread around the world. And then after the First World War, this same group of New Orleans musicians, perhaps a little bit younger ones, came on up to Chicago, and they started a new form of jazz, the Chicago style of jazz.
Right up the heart of the country.
That's right, and another group of white musicians, actually from New Orleans, went on into New York City, and there introduced it in 1917. And since then, of course, we've had a Kansas City style. We have our own San Francisco style here. There's jazz bands all around the world playing. So geographically, it's a little easier to explain than musically.
Well, is jazz purely American then? And would you give me another distinction or definition? What's the difference between jazz and classical music?
Oh, you hit me with two. I don't think we're going to be able to get that across, but you might remember that the jazz musician is interpreting, he is composing as he goes along. He is, in essence, the whole orchestra in a symphony orchestra that has just the composer that's playing. And that is, that's leading the band, the orchestra. Those instrumentalists there are reading off of the written music, not playing from the head.
So, well, I think I understand. Tell me now, we've been listening to George Lewis's organization. Where are they from and something about them?
Well, the George Lewis Band is distinctive. They've been playing together, many of them, for 30, 35 years. They're playing the way that they grew up playing in New Orleans, and they haven't diluted their form to any remarkable degree since then. And therefore, it's the only band that is playing in this so-called parent or traditional form of jazz.
Well, we here in San Francisco are the only ones who share this New Orleans orchestra?
Well, right now, of course, yes. They have been in Los Angeles and in New York City, and they also have played in various colleges around the United States.
Well, since we have the fellows right near at hand, suppose we ask them a couple of questions.
George Lewis, Lloyd Luckmann.
Hello, George. It's a pleasure indeed.
Glad to meet you.
He's curious about your music, George.
Oh, yeah?
Where did you learn to play that clarinet?
Well, I learned down in New Orleans, down at home there.
And was that for what, did you get an instrument given to you, or did you start in some other?
No, I started on a 25-cent fife in 1907.
A dime store fife.
That's right.
Do you have any kind of instruction on that? Any lessons or anything?
No lessons at all.
Just picked it up. How about you, Kid Howard? You're trumpeter in this band. You lead the melody. How did you pick up that?
Well, I've taken lessons on it, but before that time I played drum in the early 20s.
You picked up that beat by hearing the drum.
I was a drum quite a while.
That's fine. You know, we're going to want to hear these guys right away. Let's let them go on over
I
to the
certainly would.
bandstand here.
Nice to meet you, too. Fine, thank you. Fine. Well, tell me, when did they get together as to play as bands, Phil? I mean, they sound like they start up as individual.
Well, this band is a good example of that, Lloyd. They started up individually, I suppose, but I think you would have heard jazz bands playing 60 years ago in one form or another. Maybe a parade band. Or maybe like the singers, for instance, who sing together, the spiritual groups that were singing.
Well, my thought was that most of the Southern music folk music was off the plantation, that the instrument was the voice, and we have the spirituals. I didn't quite associate that background with the urban background of New Orleans.
Well, that is one of the major things. You see, that went up so early, about the 60s or 70s,
Yes.
that spirituals were thought of as the only creative form of the Negro. But I don't think you should really think of it. Think of the blues, because under this, the torment and the feeling that the Negro people had, they grew up this type of music, a slow, very, very sensuous type of music, which was called the blues or the spirituals, one or another. They're about the same.
Is this mood music, the same mood coming
That's
from?
just about the same. Whether it's on a single instrument or whether it's by a whole band playing, well, you're going to have that feeling of the blues. Lawrence Marrero on the banjo, for instance, he learned how to play from his father, as he said. That was about 40 years ago. You notice that George Lewis coming in here on the clarinet has a melody that isn't a regular pattern. But on the other hand, it's Careless Love, the one that W.C. Handy wrote down a number of years ago. Alcide Pavachot is on bass. He got a nickname Slow Drag after he won a dance contest that had that name. Now we've got Joe Watkins in on the drums as this band builds itself up playing the blues. The New Orleans drummer, of course, had to play both in a parade band as well as keeping the rhythm of going along during the dancing. You notice probably that Alton Purnell on piano there is somewhat more of a rhythm section man than a soloist of his own. Since there weren't any pianos in the marching bands, of course, well, they had to have a piano for the dances. So there was a different style in the piano than in the parade band, of course, because they weren't playing together. Now that the trumpeter has come in, Kid Howard, the melody has taken off, and he is taking the whole strain of the melody while George Lewis improvises harmonically below him.
He drops out of the melody.
Out to the melody, exactly. Now, by the addition of Jim Robinson on the trombone, we've completed George Lewis and his New Orleans band. Jim recorded in the 20s, as a matter of fact. He used to play off of the tailgates on the wagons in New Orleans.
Love, oh love, oh careless love. In your clutches of desire, you made me break a many true vow. Then you nearly set my heart on fire.
Well, that's Careless Love.
And it was a very beautiful interpretation of the blues, Phil. But somehow or other, in my idea of jazz, I think of ragtime. And does this organization indulge in a little ragtime?
Oh, yes, definitely. It's a natural thing to bring up now, too, because ragtime, as I said, was the next form of this American jazz that came to the people. Why don't we try this? This will be a band version. Of course, ragtime was on the piano at first, and then the bands took it over. Notice the 4 beats to the bar here rather than the 2 beats of the march tempo. We'll hear in a little, just
I'll
a little
listen
while.
carefully,
This will be
Phil.
Panama Rag.
Thank you. Phil, that was really jazz.
That was really ragtime. You want to start in on that again?
Well, is it always then that I think of 4-beat music when I ask you about jazz again and we get into this definition
Well, I'll
business?
tell you one sure thing. Never ask a musician whether one kind of beat or another is the only thing they can play. 2-beat, 4-beat, it's how they feel and what the occasion permits. For instance, if you're looking on a street in New Orleans and down Basin Street, let's say, or South Rampart, there's a parade coming, they're certainly not going to have 4 beats. They may have 6/8, they may have 2/4. Why don't we try one of these 2/4 marches, one of the great ones, Bugle Boy March, they call it.
Phil, this was improvisation, I take it, as you mentioned to me once before.
I think probably you'd find that not very many of these fellows in this band have seen a score of music in a number of years.
They don't read music?
Well, they don't bother. They've been playing together for a long time. They know where everybody else is going to be. They won't step on each other's toes.
Well, does this recall the same kind of improvising, say, that the a classicist, like, I can't resist bringing in the classic, Mozart, he was reputed to be a great improviser. Is that the same thing as our boys are doing here?
It might be the same thing, but I don't think the end result is the same. I think Mozart, don't you, was probably improvising with the end in sight of probably putting it down on music eventually. These men improvise as they go along. The end point is the creation of what they're doing right now.
For now.
Right now, yes.
And the idea of writing down the music, or the whole commercialization of jazz then, is somebody else's notion, not George Lewis's voice.
Well, probably so. Of course, in recent years, some of the progressive forms of jazz have treated it that jazz was a composing sort of thing, and they could compose in their own vein. But the roots of jazz are improvised. They are men creating with themselves in a band, or maybe just a few of them on various occasions in New Orleans.
Well, you take a 20th century classicist like Darius Milhaud, didn't in his piece, say The End of the World, I think that's the title, didn't he bring jazz into that?
He's brought in, well, Stravinsky has, of course,
Yes,
too, has brought in a lot. George Gershwin made use of the blues theme. They were taking ideas, maybe like Stephen Foster did with spirituals, wrote them down on paper, and then had people sing them. You've lost a little of the flavor, the individuality, you see.
I see. It's style again.
That's right, it is.
Well, now, one other question right this moment hits me, and that's this one. Here we've had jazz in March time, as you said, different beats, and we've had the ragtime. Is the notion of jazz that it's raucous, noisy?
Oh, no, not at all. That probably was perpetuated by the people who didn't know what it was all about and felt the only thing they could do was to play loud and noisy and have foghorns and steamboat whistles in the band to create an effect, you know.
Washboards and whatnot.
That's right. Well, of course, the washboard could have been used a long time ago as a rhythm before they had a drum set, for instance. But supposing, for instance, you take one of the types of music, the spiritual.
Yeah.
Many people wouldn't like to hear that done in jazz fashion, really.
Hardly.
And yet they don't realize that it was being improvised long before it was written down.
As jazz.
As jazz. Well, we call it jazz now. That's a relatively new term, actually.
So long as I don't think of it in this faster beat, is that right?
Well, fast or slow, it ain't what you do, it's the way what you do it. That's what does it. Why don't we see the George Lewis Band here now and let them do as they do so often in New Orleans, playing for a funeral. Perhaps a lodge brother has died.
This same group?
This same group, oh yes, that's one of their major jobs in New Orleans. They'll march the body down to the graveyard, a few words will be said, perhaps a song sung, and then leaving the body there, doing the best they can, they march up the street in a happier, lighter vein. One of the best of these tunes, I think, is one that I know they're going to do well, a spiritual called Just a Closer Walk with Thee.
Well, let's listen. that was really a surprise ending because I'd been taken into something of a reverie by the introduction to that beautiful spiritual. And I think I understand very much better now after this, I'd call it, concert we've had up to this moment.
Definitely.
And I know we're going to have some more numbers, or another number at least, from George and the boys. But while we're taking a rest here, giving them a chance to catch their breath, I'd like to have you hear about some of the concerts that are presented by the San Francisco Museum of Art. And our Barbara Gifford is going to tell us about them.
The music George Lewis has been playing is good, isn't it? But I imagine you've been wondering why a museum concerns itself with music, much less jazz. Well, it is one of the 7 arts, and the San Francisco Museum is a center for all kinds of art activity. Therefore, music is frequently heard at the museum. In the many concerts given at the museum, all kinds of music is heard, from ancient to modern. This ancient Japanese samisen was used this spring in a concert devoted to the Japanese theater. In the realm of modern music, the museum's This Is Jazz series, presented in 1943, did a great deal to establish an audience for jazz in the Bay Area. Let's take a look at some of the other types of programs that have been presented by the San Francisco Museum of Art. They can be roughly divided into 3 types. The first group are the soloists, who play such instruments as the flute, the violin, the cello, and various horns, as well as rarely heard instruments such as the harpsichord. Choral groups are also heard at the museum. In the Campion Festival this fall, a series of 5 programs presented songs that were unfamiliar. Some of the songs were old and others were new. One of the most popular musical events at the museum is the string quartets. The world-famous Budapest and Griller quartets are presented annually at the museum. They play both the classical compositions of Bach and Mozart, and also the works of our contemporaries, such as Darius Milhaud and Aaron Copland. You can see that the concerts at the museum are varied in scope and interesting. So that you won't miss any, look in your daily newspapers for announcements, or send us a card asking for the museum's calendar of events. The address is the San Francisco Museum of Art, Civic Center, San Francisco, California.
Phil, using our last number, Closer Walk with Thee, as an example, would it be right to say then that there are 2 kinds of jazz, jazz for listening and jazz for dancing, and maybe marching?
No, I wouldn't want to say that, because dancing goes along with jazz. It may be the mood of the group not to dance to it. For instance, some of the modern groups just play for a concert as such, and it doesn't really matter what the tune is. For instance, you can take a popular tune of any generation. If they play it in the right spirit, the right mood, the instruments are improvising within themselves, everything's fine. It doesn't have to be a jazz classic. Do you remember that tune, Ice Cream?
Very well.
About 30 years old now.
Yeah.
Well, let's listen to the George Lewis Band playing Ice Cream, and you'll get an idea of what I mean.
Very good. We have certainly enjoyed having Phil Elwood and George Lewis's band here to give us a better idea of what jazz actually is and how it's played. I think that I can now understand and appreciate jazz as an important part of our cultural heritage, and also understand the role of the New Orleans musician of 40 years ago, and 2, the importance of George Lewis's band as one of the living examples of classic jazz. Thanks for being with us. See you next week.
Now everybody wants a Pepsi Cola. Yes, you scream, I scream. Everybody wants
Discovery. Discovery has been brought to you by station KPIX and the San Francisco Museum of Art. Next week, Discovery will present S. Hurock, the famous impresario, who will tell you about his adventures in the dance world.